everybody. It's that time to do the IOS 2601 a revision again. It's interpretation of statutes revision. As we're writing on Friday, I think this will be helpful to you in case you're lazy to go through your notes, or you feel you have not studied enough. This will really help you. And let us pray and hope that you will get the desired results in the exam. Okay, I have my notes written somewhere, and I have a lot of pages. It's just my notes written in a pencil, so I will try and explain them to you where possible. Okay, we'll be just going through the questions together. It says our first question that we will look at is this one. Okay, it says briefly state the facts of the Jaga v. Dongas case. Okay, don't mind my handwriting. I will try to explain everything. Okay, Jaga was caught selling unwrought gold and was sentenced to 3 months of imprisonment, suspended for 3 years. The minister declared an undesirable inhabitant of the Union, and a warrant for his deportation to India was issued. But Jaga challenged his deportation on the basis that he had not been sentenced to imprisonment, and the minister argued that a suspended sentence of imprisonment is still a sentence of imprisonment. Jaga argued that within the ordinary meaning of the provision, imprisonment meant actual imprisonment, and he was not actually and physically held in the prison. Okay, you can go through the case in more details if you like to know more about the judgment and stuff. You can go through the case yourself. Okay, number 2, we're gonna discuss the text in context approach and the guidelines that the judges identified. I'll repeat the question. Discuss the text in context approach and the guidelines that the judges identified. Okay. How they're gonna discuss that is the text in context approach. In other words, is the purposive approach. Yeah? Okay, and then it says here, the purpose or the object of the legislation is the dominant factor in the interpretation. They are letting us know that the purpose or the object of the legislation is a dominant factor in the interpretation. Okay, and then they're telling us that to determine such purpose, the context of the legislation, including the social factor and the political policy directions, that must be taken into account. To determine such purpose, the context of the legislation, including the social factor and the political policy directions, that must be taken into account. Okay, and then continuing by team, the search for the purpose of the legislation requires purposive approach, which recognizes the contextual framework of the legislation right from the outset, meaning that the purposive approach, it recognizes the contextual framework of the legislation right from the beginning. The approach establishes a balance between the grammatical and the textual meaning, overall contextual meaning. As the interpretation provision cannot be complete until the purpose or extent of the legislation are also taken into account. Okay, and then we have here the objective intention, and then we have the mischief rule. I will skip that. You will go through that yourself, because another subject is as on its own. Sorry, on its own. Okay, we'll go through the mischief rule and the objective intention. Okay, let's just go through the objective intention, and then we'll just pass by the mischief rule. Okay, the objective intention must be determined objectively. the subjective related to intention of the legislature must be replaced by the intention in the objective sense. For example, the purpose or object of legislation. What did the legislature intend to achieve with the legislation? What did the legislature intend to achieve with the legislation? That's actually what the objective intention is all about. What did the legislative intend to achieve with the legislation? What did the legislature, that actually rhymes nicely. What did the legislature intend to achieve with the legislation? Okay, now the mischief rule. The so-called mischief rule is the basis of contextual approach. No? The mischief rules stand in contrast to its contrast, guys, CONTRAST. Contrast to the literal approach and is the basis of a purposive contextual approach to interpretation. The mischief rule acknowledges the application of external aids such as common law prior to enactment of the legislation. The mischief in the law has not provided for the new remedies, and the reasons for such remedies is to provide the interpreter with the purpose and meaning of the provisions. Okay, now to the guidelines. The guidelines they asked for. Remember the question was to discuss the text in context approach and the guidelines that the judges identify. The reason we're including our objective intention in the mischief rules because it's a discussion. They said we must discuss the text in context approach. So everything that relates to it, you can be part of your discussion. Okay, now the guidelines. Contextual approach is to be used at the beginning. Contextual approach is to be used at the beginning and the wider view, because the contextual approach actually gives you the wider view of the legislation or the provision. Even if the text is clear or ambiguous, the context must be used. In other words, even if the text that has to be interpreted is clear, you must still use the context. Now, wider context can be important than the actual grammatical meaning of the legislative text. I'll repeat that. Wider context can be actually important than wider context can be important than the actual grammatical meaning of the legislative meaning. Okay. Once the meaning of the text and the context is determined, it must be applied irrespective of whether the interpreter is of the opinion that the legislature intended something else. I'll repeat that. Once the meaning of the text and the context is determined, it must be applied irrespective of whether the interpreter is of the opinion that the legislature intended something else. Okay, now I'm going to explain. Okay, I didn't read the question, sorry for that. I'm going to discuss the orthodox text-based approach, the literal approach, and its criticism. We're going to explain or discuss the orthodox text-based literal approach and its criticism. Okay, let's go through it very fast. The interpreter must focus on the literal meaning of the provision to be interpreted. And according to the textualist, the interpretation process should proceed along the following lines. I will repeat that. The interpreter must focus on the literal meaning of the provision to be interpreted. And according to the textualist, the interpretation process should proceed along the following lines. Number one, the primary rule of the interpretation. What is it now? This is the primary rule. If the meaning of the words is clear, it should be put into effect and indeed equated with the legislature's intention. The primary rule of the interpretation, if the meaning of the words is clear. The reason they're using, like, if the meaning of the words is clear, is because of the meaning, where the emphasis is on the meaning of the words. That's why I'm saying is clear. It should be put into effect and indeed equated with the legislature's intention. Number two, secondly, is the golden rule of interpretation. If the so-called meaning, in other words, the golden rule of interpretation is the plain meaning. That's why they're saying if the so-called plain meaning of words is ambiguous or vague or misleading, or if a strict literal interpretation will result in absurd results, then the court may deviate from the literal meaning to avoid such absurdity. Then the courts will turn to the so-called secondary aids to find the intention of the legislature. Do you get it? Let me repeat it so that we understand it better together. If the so-called plain meaning of words is ambiguous or vague or misleading, or if a strict literal interpretation will result in absurd results, then the court may deviate from the literal meaning to avoid such absurdity. Then the court will turn to the so-called secondary aids to find the intention of the legislature. The secondary aids is for example, the long title, the headings to the chapters, the definition clause, schedules, etc. Okay, number three. However, now, should the so-called secondary aids prove insufficient to ascertain the intention, the court will have to recourse to the so-called tertiary aids to construction, i.e. the common law presumptions. Now we know that the example of the tertiary internal aids is the common law presumption, and then the example of the secondary, in case they ask you to list the secondary aids or the internal aids, you go for those of the long title of the statute, the headings to chapters, blah blah blah. And then when they want the tertiary ones, you just state the common law presumptions. Okay, now they're giving us the case reference with reference to the orthodox text-based approach. Says both refers to the case of the Public Carriers Associations vs. Toll Road Concessionaries as a recent example of the textual approach. Now, the court first recognized the value of the purposive or the text in context approach, but in this case the court actually recognized the value, the importance of the purposive or text in context approach, but restricted its application to cases where the textual approach failed. So in other words, according to this case, you can only use the purposive or the text in context approach if the textual approach actually fails. If it doesn't fail, that means I will stick to it when interpreting. That's the court. How should the phrase, this is the legal issue. The legal issue in this particular case that we are on it. Important that you know, you can go to your textbook and read the facts of the case, because the question might come out, state the facts of the case. How should the phrase alternative road be determined? The textual therefore did not provide solution to the problem. To resolve the dispute, the court decided to look at the purpose of the provision. The court declared that it should adopt the interpretation which best serves that purpose. The court proceeded to state that the purpose of Section 9.3 was to ensure that the road users who wished to do so could reach their final destinations or their original destination without paying the new toll fees. That being the primary object of Section 9.3, the court held that an alternative road meant an alternative route and not an alternative roadway. It was not necessary to provide a wholly separate roadway in order to achieve the object of the act. Now to the criticism of this approach. Presumption and context are ignored. The presumptions and the context are ignored. The approach is too narrow. Now you can see just that it's too narrow. The literal approach is inherently subjective and depends on the interpreter's understanding of words. Very few legislative texts are so clear that only one interpretation is possible. The textual approach leaves very little room for judicial lawmaking or for the exercise of a judicial discretion. Okay, now